President Trump is endorsing a new warning from his FCC chairman aimed at broadcasters over their coverage of the president's war with Iran. FCC chair Brendan Carr threatened to revoke their licenses over the coverage, accusing the media of running what he called hoaxes and news distortions related to the war without evidence, saying, quote, "The law is clear. Broadcasters must operate in the public interest, and they will lose their licenses if they do not." To be clear, the FCC licenses broadcast stations, but not the networks. President Trump quickly backed Carr and falsely accused outlets of coordinating with the Iranian government to spread falsehoods, going so far as to say that outlets should be, quote, brought up on charges for treason for the dissemination of false information. Let's discuss with MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard and NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik. Vaughn, these latest threats from the administration drew bipartisan criticism. Here's Senator Ron Johnson.
I'm a big supporter of the First Amendment. I do not like the heavy hand of government, no matter who's wielding it. So, no, I would rather the federal government stay out of the private sector as much as possible. And really, the federal government's role is to protect our freedoms, protect our constitutional rights.
So that is a staunch Republican ally of President Trump, and that's how he sees it. What specifically is the White House so upset about, Vaughn?
Right, Anna, we should be clear. People like Ted Cruz have also spoken out against Brendan Carr's rhetoric and threats in the past as related to late-night television hosts, for example, and Jimmy Kimmel. But when it comes to why in this White House, it's one person. It's Donald Trump, the president of the United States, who in a social media post this weekend said he is, quote, thrilled by Brendan Carr's threat to not renew licenses of these broadcast stations here. And it has to do with the fact that the president wants greater control over the news narrative about his policy and decision-making. And this comes at a moment in time in which, over the course of the last 2 weeks, since he moved forward with the Iran military operation, there have been a litany of stories questioning the U.S. negotiators who are involved in the nuclear negotiation diplomatic talks that ultimately led to Donald Trump calling for the military operation to go forward, and have called into question what the long-term strategy is of Donald Trump in this White House. The type of headlines that have really brought the ire of Donald Trump and led to this moment here where he now has the FCC chair effectively threatening news organizations if they don't provide a better narrative around the Iran war, then they could potentially lose their broadcast stations, or at least threaten to have the FCC revoke them.
David, Carr says the law is clear. Broadcasters must operate in the public interest, and they will lose their licenses if they do not. Isn't reporting the facts of the war in the public interest?
I mean, yes, evidently. That is absolutely why the broadcast networks really leaned heavily upon news coverage so many decades ago, when television news was still evolving, to point to it as a public service as a way of justifying why they would have for their local stations these free grants of these licenses to operate in those markets. There are also First Amendment issues here, as Senator Johnson raised. It would very much be likely that these would be things that were challenged in court if they came to pass. But let's look at on paper, these are empty threats, and yet there's something more serious behind it, as I think Vaughn nicely laid out a moment ago. On paper, as you point out, you can't challenge the networks, you challenge the local stations. Some of the networks do own local stations, but most stations are not owned by those networks. The three outlets that drew the ire of President Trump and also Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN. The New York Times and its parent company own no television stations. The Wall Street Journal does not hold a license to operate, right? But its ultimate owners, Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch, do own Fox stations. So in some ways that could be a threat, except the Murdochs are such close allies of the president, and this White House would never happen. Separately, you have the question of CNN. That's not even a broadcast network. That's a cable network, not regulated, like the network we're on at the moment. It is about to be bought by the Ellisons, Larry and David Ellison. They do own local stations at CBS, but again, they've allied themselves carefully and assiduously with this White House, even as they say the editorial processes, newsrooms would operate independently. It would seem unlikely they would use that to block relicensing of the CBS stations that they hold. So what are we really talking about? This is a moment where Brendan Carr, who's supposed to operate as head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, somewhat at a remove from the White House in partisan politics, he's operating hand in glove with the White House and signaling as closely as he can as his MAGA identity as anyone else in a way that he never did during Trump's first term, though he was at the FCC at the time then too. And what you're seeing is an effort to, I think, not only try to affect the coverage that emanates from major news outlets, but even the questions that are being posed at a time of war. Inconvenient and difficult questions. And they are trying to signal not only to those news proprietors that seek to be entirely independent of political pressure, but those that seek to be somewhat allied with the White House, that they are not going to let variance from the kinds of coverage they want to slip by unnoticed. They want to pressure the outcome.
I mean, freedom of the press has been such a huge underpinning of the democracy in this country, right, in order to hold people in power accountable, to be that government watchdog. Yet this is the latest from a string of controversial moves from this FCC chair that seems to try to squash or quash the freedom of the press. Since taking up the job, he opened an inquiry into Kamala Harris's 60 Minutes interview. He ordered investigations into NPR and PBS sponsorships. He's threatened to pull ABC's license over Jimmy Kimmel's Charlie Kirk monologue, and he pressured ABC's affiliates to take him off the air. He opened up another probe into The View just last month. David, what does this tell you about how Brendan Carr sees his role?
It's an extremely activist and muscular interpretation of the authority of the FCC to get involved in the weeds of what's said, sort of almost actively encouraging certain kinds of complaints to come in, giving him the leverage to act and to investigate and to review, holding stations very much accountable for what their parent networks or their affiliated networks do, and really getting into the questions that have been left alone and treated in a more laissez-faire way for decades, getting into, as you point out, late night, getting into and the kinds of interviews that are being done there, getting into daytime television in a way where there were easements from certain kinds of requirements for equal time during election seasons. And you can argue there may be good principles involved about wanting to make sure certain kinds of coverage is fair and is fair to all sides. And at the same time, you're seeing an intervention in terms of the ability of these news outlets to operate without political interference from some of the highest officials in the land. And I think that's the issue that Senator Johnson, a lot of Democrats, but a lot of people outside government would point to as well. All of this stuff that I say could be subject to legal challenges, but when corporate owners have so many interests in front of the government, in certain cases, so many contracts with the government, oftentimes they will ease back on challenging this administration in court because they have greater interests at play. And that's really I think, the dynamic that we're seeing at the moment.
It's a slippery slope. Thank you so much, David Folkenflik, Von Hilliard. Appreciate the conversation, guys.